Journey to the Colosseum. What happened to 3,000 Christian martyrs? Architectural marvel of the 1st century, 160 feet tall, 620 feet long by 513 feet wide, 100,000 cubic meters of stone and concrete, housing up to 50,000 bloodthirsty spectators.
Was it the glory of Rome or a brutal slaughterhouse to 3,000 Christian martyrs? To answer that question, we need to go back to the beginning.
It was 30 AD, and Judea, or Palestine as the Romans would call it, was a distant backwater in the Roman Empire, plagued by frequent ethnic and religious uprisings.
Shortly before his crucifixion on a Roman cross, a young rabbi would make the following statement.
But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is at hand. Luke 21:20.
40 years later, this statement would come true in dramatic fashion.
Titus Vespasianus descended upon Jerusalem with 4 Roman legions, 24,000 soldiers, obliterating the sacred temple and most of the Jewish population.
What was left of Jerusalem was carted back to Rome in triumphal procession,
memorialized to this day on the Arch of Titus. To commemorate his son's victory, Emperor Vespasian began construction of a stadium that would dwarf all others that had come before it. The structure was completed by his son in 80 AD, and a 4th story added 2 years later by Emperor Domitian. But none of these Flavian emperors would lift a literal finger.
The magnificent Colosseum was actually built by enslaved Jews from Judea and paid for with the plunder of Jerusalem.
Amphitheaters were nothing new to antiquity. In ancient Greece and Rome, they were used for religious celebrations, civic debates, and elections, as well as, most notably, fine theatrical presentations, many of which have survived in written form to the present day.
But the colossal Flavian amphitheater was much too grandiose for such noble activities.
Instead, gladiators took the stage, squaring off in savage, bloody combat to the death.
And when the novelty of these lethal contests wore off,
lions, tigers, and other exotic animals were imported from distant lands to serve as both combatants and executioners.
Perhaps befitting the Colosseum's bloody conception, blood became its primary purpose.
As political unrest grew, so did the size and violence of these spectacles. At one point, the Colosseum was filled with water to enact a sea battle, drowning untold numbers of hapless participants.
Shockingly, many who died in the Colosseum volunteered to do so.
And I'm not talking about the convicted criminals who chose to fight as gladiators for a chance at freedom. I'm talking about the thousands who were bound hand and foot to be fed to beasts, or hung on crosses, or burned at the stake.
Many of whom could have avoided death simply by bowing the knee before the image of Caesar.
The first recorded Christian martyr in the Colosseum was Saint Ignatius, during the reign of Emperor Trajan. He was the Bishop of Antioch, student of Polycarp and St. John the Apostle, and early church father who wrote at least 7 epistles that still survive today.
In his own writings, he described how he was transported by 8 Roman soldiers all the way to Rome to be fed to beasts. His only crime? Refusing to worship Roman gods.
Many early writers refer to the martyrdom of St. Ignatius, including Eusebius, St. Jerome, and John Chrysostom, who was the first to place his death in the Colosseum.
In the next 2 centuries, 3,000 Christians would follow St. Ignatius to a similar death before tens of thousands of spectators in the Colosseum.
And for what? A dream of heavenly glory? A fantasy in the clouds? What could possibly be so attractive in this new religion that it would be worth such an unattractive death?
In the history of the Church, Eusebius tells us why.
The bishops of the Church that evinced by their blood the genuineness of the religion which they preached. In the presence of the emperor, he proclaimed the heavenly kingdom of Christ, first in an oral defense and afterwards by deeds as well.
For nearly 300 years, Christians proved the truth of the gospel by dying for it, and this gave them audience with emperors.
And then one day, a Roman emperor named Constantine saw a vision of a shining cross in the sky and heard the words, "In hoc signo vinces," or "by this sign conquer."
After his conversion, Constantine stopped the long-standing state-sponsored persecution of Christians.
The bloody days of the Colosseum were coming to an end. After the fall of the Western Empire in 476 AD, the Great Walls began to crumble. By the 12th century, it was repurposed as a fortress, and in the 15th, as a rock quarry.
It wasn't until the 1990s that state-funded restoration efforts began anew.
Today, it is one of the most visited sites in Italy and most iconic buildings in the world. But the infamous Colosseum will forever be remembered for the 3,000 Christian martyrs who died there.
The fear of death could not stop them from sharing the gospel. What is stopping you?